The year 1942. The war in Europe had long since spiraled beyond control, but now, across the vast expanse of the Atlantic Ocean, the tides were shifting. The world would soon feel the true weight of a battle that raged unseen, beneath the waves, in the cold darkness of the sea. It was the golden age of U-boat warfare. The German Wolfpacks, led with ruthless precision by the formidable commander Karl Dönitz, had grown to become a terror unlike any the Allies had faced before. With daring audacity, they had emerged from the depths to strike, their attacks as sudden as they were lethal. For months, their successes seemed unstoppable, and the Allies were caught in a chokehold they could scarcely hope to escape. It was here, on the fringes of the American coastline, where the scale of the U-boat campaign would reveal its devastating potency. Hundreds of thousands of tons of vital shipping were being lost with alarming regularity, sinking to the bottom of the ocean, leaving no trace but the wreckage of a fragile, besieged supply line. The loss was not only in material, it was in morale, in hope. These were the lifeblood of the Allies' war effort. Convoys of men, munitions, food, and fuel bound for the embattled shores of Europe, now swallowed whole by the sea. To the sailors braving the ocean's fury, it must have seemed like the end was near. The U-boats were hunting them down with a ferocity and skill that made escape a distant dream. The Allies had not yet found a way to effectively counter the storm of steel lurking beneath the waves. Each attack carried a lesson in fear. Each day that passed without relief saw the world inching closer to catastrophe. The war was about logistics, and without the necessary supplies, victory on the European continent seemed a cruel, impossible dream. The Americans, still new to the war but already proving their strength, watched as their own coastline, long considered safe, became the hunting grounds for these silent predators. Dönitz's Wolfpacks operated in tight formations, working together with lethal precision. His men were trained not just to hunt, but to understand the rhythm of the sea, the tactics of the convoy, the subtle shifts in weather that could turn the ocean from a calm expanse into a deadly trap. They worked in the dark, under the cover of night, weaving between convoys, waiting for their moment to strike. The hunt was a delicate, methodical process, and each success only emboldened the U-boat commanders. Yet for all the terror they unleashed, the U-boats were not invincible. Their victims, the men aboard the freighters and warships, fought back with a desperation born of necessity. But the scale of the war was vast. The Atlantic, as treacherous as it was vast too. And the U-boats, for all their power, could not be everywhere at once. The Allies' response would come, though it wouldn't come easily. The technological race had begun, but at the time it seemed as though the Allies were losing. The German submarines, armed with advanced torpedoes and stealthy designs, had the upper hand. They attacked swiftly, without warning, and vanished into the abyss just as quickly. Yet the true carnage they caused was not just in the sinking of ships. It was in the disruption of the war effort, the creation of panic and uncertainty that spread through the ranks of the Allies. As the Wolfpacks tightened their grip, so too did the pressure on the American industry to respond. The war had reached a critical juncture. The United States could not afford to lose vital supplies. It was here, in the face of this unseen carnage, that the Allied need for a technological miracle grew more urgent. A solution to combat the U-boat menace was not just a tactical necessity, it was a matter of survival. The Allies, ever resourceful, would need to rise to the challenge. They would need to find a way to turn the tide of war, to outsmart the relentless machines that hunted them from below. But that solution was not yet on the horizon. The technological miracle had not yet arrived. The war at sea was still very much alive, and its cost was mounting with every day that passed. The U-boats remained a dark, unstoppable force, sinking ship after ship, turning the Atlantic into a graveyard of steel and dreams. In the wake of every sunken vessel, the reality of defeat seemed to edge closer, and the Allies were forced to reckon with the possibility that their supply lines might never recover. The economic and strategic repercussions were immeasurable. Each ship lost was more than just an object. It was a vital part of the machinery of war, now consumed by the sea. Yet amid the mounting losses, the possibility of victory still lingered. As dire as the situation appeared, the story of the U-boat dominance was not one of absolute triumph. The Allied resolve was stronger than ever. They would learn from their mistakes, adapt, and innovate. The technological race was about to take a sharp turn, one that would change the course of the war forever. But for now, in 1942, the Allied forces were locked in a desperate struggle, fighting not just for survival, but for the future of the free world. The tides would change, but not yet. The grim reality of U-boat dominance was in full force, and the stakes had never been higher. The Allies could only hope that somewhere in the depths of research and development, a solution would emerge, a technological breakthrough that would turn the tide of this silent, unseen war beneath the waves. And it was that hope, that glimmer of possibility, that kept the fight alive. Without it, all would be lost. The Second Happy Time, as it came to be known, was a testament to the power of the U-boats and the terror they spread across the Atlantic. But it was also a reminder of the relentless pursuit of victory, of the determination that would eventually lead the Allies to turn the tide against this deadly force. The battle for the seas was not over, and the struggle for control of the Atlantic would continue. But in the darkest days of 1942, the stage was set for a confrontation that would forever change the nature of naval warfare, and the world would soon find out just how much was at stake. The year was 1942. The war had taken an ugly turn. The Allies, despite their overwhelming industrial potential and manpower, were being systematically crippled by an invisible, silent enemy: German U-boats. They were the hunters of the Atlantic, lurking beneath the waves, poised to strike. Yet, as they hunted, they faced an enemy just as formidable: the Allies' desperate attempts to counter their attacks. But these efforts, at least initially, proved to be disastrous failures, born of inexperience and technological limitations. The convoys, the lifeblood of Allied supply chains, were the perfect target. Massive, lumbering formations of merchant ships, escorted by warships that were too slow, too outdated, and far too vulnerable. These were the vessels that bore the material and human weight of the war, carrying everything from weapons to food, fuel to ammunition. Yet, as each convoy set sail, it did so with the knowledge that somewhere out in the vast Atlantic, hidden beneath the dark expanse, the U-boats waited. It was a terrifying reality for those aboard these ships. The escorts, too, felt the weight of their impotence. Despite their best efforts, they were simply outmatched by the cunning and stealth of the Wolfpacks. The early stages of American anti-submarine warfare, ASW, were plagued by catastrophic failures. The Allies, in their haste to respond, were trapped by their own limitations. The technology was rudimentary at best. Depth charges, the weapon of choice against submarines, were launched blindly, often with little effect. Sonar was still in its infancy, unreliable and often easily evaded by the nimble U-boats. These technological gaps were compounded by a fundamental misunderstanding of the scope and scale of the threat. The U-boats could strike and disappear before the Allies could even react, making any countermeasures appear laughably ineffective. The German U-boat commanders knew all too well the shortcomings of the Allied defenses. They were not just confident, they were arrogant, secure in the belief that the vast open ocean was their domain. They knew that no matter how many ships the Allies threw at the problem, they could always outmaneuver them. After all, the ocean was infinite. The U-boats could strike and disappear, taking out ship after ship while remaining unseen. The Wolfpacks hunted not just in numbers but with a precision that made them seem unstoppable. For every convoy that was sunk, another would soon follow. The Allies were helpless, seemingly unable to protect their precious supply lines from the ever-looming threat of the U-boat. The Allies' response was slow, almost agonizingly so. They tried everything from new weapons to new tactics, but nothing seemed to work. Convoys continued to be picked off at will, and the losses mounted. Yet, for all their frustration, the U-boats remained untouchable, and this only fed the arrogance of their commanders. The vastness of the ocean gave them a sense of invincibility. No matter how many ships were lost, the U-boats would always find another way to strike. They had the upper hand, and it seemed that nothing could stop them. In this climate of failure and desperation, the German captains reveled in their dominance. They became confident in the belief that the Allies would never catch up. With each passing attack, the U-boats only grew bolder, their morale soaring as the Allies floundered in their attempts to mount an effective defense. The sea, which had once seemed so daunting to the German U-boat captains, now felt like their own personal hunting ground, one where they could operate with impunity. The situation, from their perspective, was almost laughable. The Allies simply could not get it right. The real tragedy, however, lay not just in the U-boat's successes, but in the flawed, outdated strategies of the Allied response. Convoys continued to travel in predictable patterns, and while this made them easier targets for the U-boats, the Allies seemed to be caught in a vicious cycle of missteps. With each failed countermeasure, their confidence waned, and the U-boat commanders, sensing the mounting fear and frustration, became ever more emboldened. The Americans, now deeply embroiled in the war, were particularly vulnerable. Their navy was growing, but it was still young, still learning. The U-boats' methods were a brutal test of their resolve and capability. They had not yet developed the technological edge they so desperately needed. Radar, sonar, and depth charges all were rudimentary, not yet the finely tuned weapons that would one day turn the tide. As the Wolfpacks took their toll, the helplessness of the Allied forces was apparent, each new defeat revealing the stark truth. The battle for the Atlantic was still very much a German victory. Yet even in the darkest moments of despair, there was a sense that the Allies were not finished. They were learning. Slowly, surely, they were beginning to understand the true nature of the threat. But the U-boats, for the moment, were still untouchable. They had the upper hand, and they knew it. This grim reality fostered the growing confidence of German U-boat captains. They were at the height of their power, operating with almost unfathomable precision. To them, victory seemed inevitable. They had mastered the sea, and the Allies, in their estimation, would be unable to stop them. But as history would reveal, the U-boats' arrogance would prove to be their undoing. Their overconfidence blinded them to the fact that the Allies, despite their early failures, were far from beaten. The technological and tactical innovations that would eventually turn the tide of the war were already in the works. But for now, in 1942, the sea was still the U-boat's kingdom, and the world watched, helpless, as the Germans brought their war to the very doorstep of the American coastline. The convoys continued, their ranks thinned, their losses growing. The ocean was vast, but the U-boat's reach seemed endless. It would take more than just brute force to break this dominance. The Allies needed not just a response, but a revolution, a technological breakthrough that could bring the fight back to the U-boats. And so, the war raged on, the stakes growing higher with each passing day, each sunken ship, each lost convoy. The Americans knew they had to act, but they also knew that time was running out. The U-boats could not be stopped by force alone. They had to outthink them, outmaneuver them. The battle for the Atlantic was far from over, and the U-boats had not yet seen their final defeat. The Type 7 U-boat, sleek and deadly, was the epitome of German naval ambition, a vessel designed for stealth, precision, and destruction. For those who served aboard, it was a symbol of power, an extension of their will over the vast, unrelenting ocean. But beyond its technological sophistication, there was a mindset, a doctrine that defined its use. The U-boat was not merely a tool of war, it was a philosophy in motion, and the men who commanded them, like the renowned Günther Prien, believed their craft were the ultimate oceanic predators, unrivaled and undetectable in their domain. The core of the U-boat doctrine, the very essence of its effectiveness lay in the Wolfpack strategy. A system of synchronized attack, where U-boats would operate together in groups, coordinating their strikes with deadly precision through a network of radio communications. They were not lone predators, but part of a unified force, each U-boat relying on the others for success. The doctrine was as much about psychology as it was about tactics, an unwavering belief that the ocean belonged to them, that no allied force could ever outmaneuver their subtle and ruthless approach. In the early days of their dominance, U-boat captains like Prion were not just soldiers, they were hunters, living by the unspoken creed that the sea was their kingdom. They trained relentlessly, mastering their vessels and perfecting the art of stealth. For them, there was an almost mythical quality to their mission, a conviction that no matter how vast the ocean, no matter how many ships were deployed, they could always remain undetected, always strike with devastating effect. The Type 7, with its innovative design, offered them an unparalleled advantage. Its streamlined hull and advanced engine allowed it to travel great distances while maintaining a low profile. Its speed, though not the fastest in comparison to surface vessels, was enough to close in on convoys with stealth, and its sonar systems, while rudimentary by later standards, were revolutionary for the time. To the U-boat captain, it was an ideal weapon, able to stalk the enemy, strike with precision, and vanish into the depths of the ocean before the victim even knew what had hit them. But it was not just the machine that gave these men their sense of superiority. It was the doctrine of the Wolfpack itself, the belief that their synchronized attacks, carefully timed and executed, could overwhelm any defense. Radio communication, while primitive, became the lifeblood of the Wolfpack. Each U-boat in the pack was in constant contact, sharing vital information about convoy positions, course changes, and sightings. This level of coordination allowed them to strike with near impunity, attacking from multiple angles, confusing and terrifying their prey. For U-boat commanders like Prion, there was no greater honor than the successful execution of this doctrine. The thrill of the hunt, the satisfaction of a successful attack was what drove them. They were not merely fighting a war, they were proving a point, proving that they could outwit, outmaneuver, and destroy anything the Allies threw at them. In the early days of the war, they had no reason to doubt their superiority. Their successes, while costly, only reinforced the belief that the U-boat was the perfect weapon of war and that it could not be stopped. Yet this arrogance, this overconfidence, would prove to be their undoing. The U-boat captains had become so entrenched in their belief that they ruled the seas that they failed to recognize the growing threat of Allied technological advancements. The Wolfpack doctrine, for all its precision and effectiveness, relied on the element of surprise, on maintaining secrecy and stealth. But as the Allies began to adapt, to innovate, that advantage slowly eroded. The initial successes of the U-boats, especially in 1940 and 1941, gave the German Navy a sense of invincibility. Convoys were picked off with frightening ease, their cargo of vital supplies sinking to the ocean floor. The Allies struggled to mount an effective defense, and the U-boat captains knew it. They watched from their hidden perches as the ocean seemed to belong to them, and they grew confident, almost cocky. No longer was the Wolfpack just a tactic. It became a symbol of their dominance, a doctrine that could not be defeated. This belief was not just ingrained in the officers at the helm of the Type sect boats, but in the very culture of the U-boat service. There was a sense of elitism that pervaded their ranks. To be chosen as a U-boat captain was a mark of distinction, an affirmation of both skill and courage. It was a duty that few could comprehend, let alone match. In the cramped, damp quarters of the U-boat, surrounded by the constant hum of machinery and the salty air of the sea, the crew knew they were part of something special. They were not mere sailors, they were the hunters, and the ocean was their prey. But this culture, for all its intensity and focus, also bred a certain arrogance. The U-boat captains, so accustomed to their successes, grew complacent in their tactics. They believed that the Allies would never be able to match them, never be able to truly counter their methods. They were wrong. The first cracks in the facade appeared as the Allies began to develop new technologies to combat the U-boat threat. The introduction of improved radar, better sonar systems, and more effective depth charges all began to level the playing field. But it was the development of long-range aircraft and the establishment of convoy protection strategies that truly started to turn the tide. The Germans, however, were slow to recognize these changes. They were still operating under the assumption that their dominance in the Atlantic was inevitable, that the Allies could never match the precision and skill of their Wolfpacks. Günther Prien, a celebrated U-boat captain, epitomized the mindset of his peers. For him, the Type 7 was not just a tool of war, it was a symbol of German superiority, the embodiment of the perfect weapon. He believed that no one could rival the skill and precision of the U-boat captains, and that no defensive measure could truly thwart their attacks. The Type 7 was an extension of his own identity as a warrior, a piece of technology that promised victory as long as the captain held the reins. But as the Allies adapted, the Wolfpacks began to lose their advantage. The new technologies that the Germans had once scoffed at slowly began to disrupt their operations. The arrogance of the U-boat commanders, their belief in their own invincibility, left them blind to the growing threat. They had failed to see that their doctrine, once flawless, was no longer enough. The technological miracle they so arrogantly dismissed was coming, and with it, the end of the U-boat's dominance. This was the crucial moment of change, a moment where the hunters who had once ruled the ocean began to understand that they were no longer the apex predators. The arrogance that had once fueled their success would now be their downfall, and in that shift, the U-boat captains who had once believed they were unstoppable would find themselves outmatched by an enemy they could not outwit, outmaneuver, or destroy. The year was 1943, and the war at sea was spiraling into a deadly stalemate. For years, the German U-boats had operated with devastating success, hunting and sinking Allied convoys with near impunity. Their dominance seemed unshakable. But in the darkest hours of this silent battle, a breakthrough was quietly taking shape. A technological game-changer that would shift the balance of power in the Atlantic. This breakthrough would come not from a single nation, but from a collaboration between Britain and the United States, a partnership that would create one of the most critical pieces of military technology in the war, centimetric radar. It began in the secrecy of British laboratories, as scientists worked tirelessly to overcome the limitations of radar technology. Early radar systems, which had been used effectively in detecting enemy aircraft, were ineffective against the sleek, silent U-boats lurking beneath the waves. The problem was simple, yet insurmountable. The long wavelengths used by the early radar systems were simply too large to detect the small, subtle signature of a U-boat's periscope or snorkel, even when they were visible on the surface. For years, the U-boats remained undetected, operating with near total freedom. But in Britain, a group of scientists had begun to work on a revolutionary new radar system, one that would use much shorter, centimetric wavelengths. These smaller waves would allow the radar to detect much smaller objects, even something as tiny as a U-boat's periscope, slicing through the heavy Atlantic seas. This was not just an innovation. It was a radical leap forward, a technological solution to the problem that had plagued the Allies for so long. The development of this new radar system, which could effectively spot U-boats in the heaviest seas, was nothing short of a miracle, a breakthrough that had seemed impossible just months before. In the spring of 1941, as British scientists worked in isolation, the war effort on the other side of the Atlantic was intensifying. The United States, having entered the war after Pearl Harbor, found itself facing an overwhelming challenge. The U-boats were everywhere, and the convoy system, the lifeblood of the Allied war effort, was being systematically destroyed. But as luck would have it, the Americans had an advantage. The British had already made substantial progress in radar development. And now, an Anglo-American partnership would take that progress and push it to the next level. British scientists, including the brilliant minds at the Telecommunications Research Establishment, had made an initial breakthrough in the use of centimetric radar. But the technology still needed refinement, and the production capabilities to scale it up were not yet in place. That's when the Americans stepped in, offering their vast industrial resources and technical expertise. The result was a collaboration that would produce one of the most effective anti-submarine weapons in history. By late 1942, the Americans were producing the first of these new centimetric radar sets, which could be installed on convoy escort ships. These systems, which operated on a wavelength of 10 centimeters, represented the first true technological counterpunch against the U-boats. No longer would the Allies be powerless in the face of the U-boat stealth. No longer would the convoy escorts have to rely on rudimentary sonar or visual sightings, which could be easily evaded or missed entirely. With the new radar, the U-boats would no longer have the advantage of invisibility. The ocean was no longer their domain. It was now a battlefield, one where detection and counterattack could take place in real time. The impact of this innovation was immediate. The radar allowed escort vessels to spot U-boats with unprecedented accuracy. Even in the heaviest seas, even under the cover of darkness, the U-boat's periscopes or snorkels would give off a distinctive signature. It was as though a veil had been lifted from the ocean, revealing the hidden enemy lurking beneath the waves. The ability to detect the U-boats at such a distance, before they could strike, was a game-changer, one that turned the tide in the battle for the Atlantic. But the breakthrough did not come easily. The technology was complex, and the development of the radar systems required intense cooperation between scientists and engineers on both sides of the Atlantic. The British provided the initial research, but it was the Americans who took that research and brought it to fruition, scaling it up for mass production. In early 1943, the first centimetric radar systems were deployed aboard American and British escort vessels, and they quickly proved their worth. The impact on the war was immediate and profound. Convoy escorts, now equipped with the new radar, could detect U-boats with far greater accuracy and at much greater distances than before. This gave them the time they needed to respond, either by launching counterattacks or by calling for reinforcements. The U-boats, once able to strike from the shadows, were now forced into the open. They could no longer operate with the same impunity, and their losses mounted. The Allies had gained a crucial advantage in the battle for the Atlantic, thanks to the groundbreaking work of scientists, engineers, and industrialists who had come together in a shared effort to defeat the U-boat menace. For the U-boat commanders, the new radar represented a terrifying shift in the dynamics of the war. They had relied on the darkness of the sea, on the stealth of their attacks to outwit their enemies. But now, they were being hunted. The Allies had a tool that could finally level the playing field. And with that tool, the Allies began to push back. The Wolfpacks, once so confident in their ability to hunt with impunity, were now on the defensive. The true significance of this technological breakthrough cannot be overstated. It was not just a radar system. It was a symbol of what could be achieved through cooperation, innovation, and determination. The new radar represented the first real technological countermeasure to the U-boats, and it set the stage for the eventual destruction of the Wolfpacks. But the impact was not just military. It was moral as well. It demonstrated that, even in the darkest days of war, the Allies had the ability to adapt, to innovate, and to overcome the most insurmountable challenges. By 1944, the full impact of the centimetric radar was being felt across the Atlantic. The U-boats, once so confident in their dominance, were being hunted down with increasing frequency. The convoy system, once in danger of collapse, was now protected by the new radar technology. And as the war in Europe reached its final stages, the Allies had gained a critical edge in the battle for the Atlantic. The game had changed, and the U-boats were no longer the unstoppable force they had once been. The technological revolution that began with a British breakthrough and ended with American mass production had tipped the balance of power, delivering a decisive blow to the Wolfpacks that would shape the course of the war. In the early 1940s, as the Atlantic War waged on, the U-boat menace grew ever more formidable. The German Wolfpacks, The fleets of U-boats hunting in coordinated packs were wreaking havoc on Allied convoys, sinking vital shipments of men, munitions, and supplies. The Wolfpack doctrine relied on the silent communication between U-boats, using encrypted radio transmissions to synchronize their movements across vast distances. It was a system that was both their strength and their fatal flaw. At the heart of their success was the radio, the invisible thread that linked the U-boats and allowed them to pounce on their prey. It was a system that allowed them to coordinate their attacks, share vital information, and strike when and where the convoys were most vulnerable. But what the Germans did not know was that the Allies had begun to understand this system. And soon, they would turn it against them. The weapon that would deal the final blow to the U-boat's ability to operate in the shadows was called Huff-Duff, high-frequency direction finding. A simple, yet profound technology that would forever change the rules of the game. At its core, Huff-Duff was a passive listening device that allowed Allied ships to listen in on the very radio transmissions that were the lifeblood of the German Wolfpacks. The brilliance of Huff-Duff lay in its ability to triangulate the exact location of any U-boat transmitting a radio message. For the Germans, this posed a nightmare scenario. Their essential communication system was now a homing beacon, and the Allies were listening. It was a war of invisibility. U-boats striking from the depths of the ocean, unseen and undetected. Yet the power of radio gave them a way to communicate and coordinate their strikes. They had become so reliant on their radio systems that the very moment they activated their transmitters, they unknowingly signaled their location. The U-boat captains had always believed they were safe beneath the surface, their stealth making them impervious to attack. But Huff-Duff changed everything. Now it was the U-boats that were being hunted. Huff-Duff worked by simply listening to the radio signals emitted by the U-boats. Unlike radar, which required an active search, Huff-Duff was a passive system. It did not send out any signals of its own, it only listened. And when a U-boat transmitted its orders to its pack or communicated its position, the Huff-Duff receivers aboard Allied ships could pinpoint the location of the U-boat with astonishing accuracy. The beauty of the system lay in its simplicity. Once a U-boat transmitted a message, it was only a matter of time before the Allies could triangulate its position using multiple listening stations. It didn't matter how fast the U-boat tried to move or how far it traveled. If it used its radio, it became visible. The sea, once an infinite expanse of possibility, was now a deadly trap for the German submarine fleets. But the Germans did not immediately realize the true danger of Huff-Duff. At first, they believed their transmission encryption would protect them. They did not yet understand that their very act of communication was the key to their undoing. It wasn't just the content of the messages being intercepted. It was their very frequency, the pattern of their emissions that was being used against them. The Allies could track the signals, figure out the U-boats' locations, and act swiftly. The first signs that the Allies had begun to master Huff-Duff appeared in 1942, when convoys began to report inexplicable successes in their defense against U-boat attacks. Escort ships, once the hunted, were now able to respond with unprecedented precision to attacks, dispatching depth charges with deadly accuracy, often before the U-boats even realized they had been spotted. The U-boat captains, initially baffled by this newfound ability to pinpoint their positions, soon discovered the truth. The Allies had learned to listen to them, and in that moment, the power dynamic of the Atlantic shifted irreparably. As the war dragged on, the significance of Huff-Duff only grew. The technology became one of the key tools in the Battle of the Atlantic, allowing the Allies to turn the U-boat's greatest strength, its ability to communicate and coordinate attacks, into a glaring weakness. The result was devastating for the Germans. The Wolfpacks that had once operated with such confidence were now being picked off one by one, as the Allies honed their ability to detect and destroy them before they could strike. But the German response was slow. They could not fathom that their reliance on radio communication, which had once been so effective, was now the very thing that would doom them. It was not until late 1943, after sustained losses and repeated failures to understand the technological shift, that the Germans realized the scale of the threat posed by Huff-Duff, and by then it was too late. The system itself, as sophisticated as it was far from perfect, but the psychological impact on the U-boat crews was immense. Once a U-boat captain knew that their position could be triangulated at any moment, the uncertainty and fear of being hunted became overwhelming. No longer could they rely on the anonymity of the sea. The Wolfpack that had once hunted in the dark depths was now exposed, their every move tracked and anticipated by the enemy. The success of Huff-Duff was not just about technology, it was about understanding the enemy's vulnerabilities and exploiting them. The Allies had cracked the U-boat's code. They had discovered that their dependence on communication could be used against them, and they had created a countermeasure that turned the tide of the war. What began as a technology to protect convoys became the tool that destroyed the Wolfpacks, one radio transmission at a time. And so, in the quiet hum of the Huff-Duff equipment aboard Allied ships, the death of the Wolfpack was quietly sealed. The U-boats could still strike, still maneuver, but their advantage was gone. The invisible net that had once been their domain was now a trap, and no matter how cunning the captain, no matter how silent the submarine, there was no escaping it. The Germans had built a powerful weapon, but it was their very reliance on communication, their essential Wolfpack radio system, that had made them vulnerable to a weapon they could neither detect nor evade. It was a fatal miscalculation that would define the outcome of the Battle of the Atlantic, and ultimately, the war at sea. The Germans had underestimated the power of the Allies' passive listening, and in doing so, they sealed their own fate. The cold of the North Atlantic was unforgiving, as it always was. On the morning of October 7, 1943, Oberleutnant zur See Fritz Jürgen Storch, commander of U-boat U-402, made a grim entry in his logbook. His boat was submerged at 180 meters, trailing convoy ONS-5, a slow-moving target in the midst of the vicious, unrelenting battle for control of the Atlantic. Storch had led his Wolfpack, a tight formation of U-boats, into the hunt. They had been tracking the convoy for hours, silently waiting for the moment to strike. The skies were clear, but the sea was rough. The hunt was becoming routine, a battle of patience. With each passing minute, the convoy was within striking distance. His men were ready, their hands hovering over the triggers that would unleash the deadly force of the Wolfpack on the unsuspecting ships above. The plan was simple: attack swiftly, silently, and without warning, just as they had done countless times before. The U-boats relied on their ability to vanish into the sea, invisible, undetectable. Communication was key. Through careful and calculated radio transmissions, the pack would coordinate the attack all at once, like a well-tuned orchestra. The ocean was their domain, and the radio was their voice, linking them together in perfect synchrony. But on this day, something changed. Storch, staring at his navigational charts, caught sight of something he had not expected, something that didn't make sense. One of his men, the radio operator, interrupted his thoughts, his voice urgent. "Sir, we've been pinged. It's an escort ship. They're in our range. They've spotted us. Impossible." Storch's mind raced. It couldn't be. There had been no sonar contact, no visual sighting. The convoy was over 1,000 meters away. How could they possibly know where they were? His thoughts were interrupted by a sudden, deafening explosion. Depth charges. The shock rattled through the hull, sending cold terror through his crew. The U-boat groaned under the pressure as another explosion echoed through the water. How had they found them? How could an escort ship with no sonar, no visual contact, and no acoustic evidence locate them so accurately? The answer, as Storch would soon learn, was terrifyingly simple. The Allies had developed a method to track U-boats not by their sound or their appearance, but by their very presence, the invisible radio signals they had been transmitting. This was the moment of realization, the dawning of a terrifying truth. The U-boat, once the undisputed predator of the deep, had now become the prey. The Wolfpack was no longer invisible. The Allies had developed a new weapon, one that would turn their secret communication system into a death sentence. The technology, known as Huff-Duff or high-frequency direction finding, had been quietly introduced into Allied convoy escorts. This passive listening system did not require radar or sonar. It simply listened for the radio transmissions emitted by the U-boats, the very signals that had allowed them to coordinate their attacks. The Huff-Duff system could pick up these signals and triangulate the location of the U-boat with uncanny accuracy. In the midst of the attack on Convoy ONS-5, Storch's worst fears were realized. They had been betrayed by the very tool that had once been their lifeline. His boat had been transmitting a message to other U-boats in the area, a simple report of their position. But the moment they did, the Allies had heard it. Their Convoy Escort, a seemingly innocuous merchant vessel with an unassuming radio officer, had now become an instrument of death. The depth charges were not a coincidence. They were the product of the Allies' newly developed ability to pinpoint a U-boat's location based on its radio transmission. The crew aboard U-402 scrambled to evade, but it was too late. Another set of depth charges exploded, closer this time, rattling the U-boat's fragile hull. The ship groaned in protest as the sea around them seemed to close in. Storch's mind raced. He had no explanation, no defense. The reality of this new war was sinking in. The enemy they had fought for so long had grown invisible, unpredictable, and worse, they were now in the hunt. For the U-boat commanders, this shift was beyond comprehension. Their entire strategy had been built around the idea of operating undetected, invisible to the enemy. And now, that advantage was gone. Storch's disbelief was echoed by his men. How could this be? They had submerged deep beneath the waves, far out of reach of sonar, far from the prying eyes of aircraft. Yet here they were, trapped, hunted by a force they could neither see nor hear. The realization came as a cold, unrelenting shock. The invisible enemy was no longer a distant possibility, but a terrifying, present reality. For months, the Allies had quietly developed the tools to listen in on the very frequencies the Germans had used to command their attacks. Every transmission, every order sent by radio was now an invitation to death. The battle for Convoy ONS-5 was one of the most intense of the war, and it was marked by a growing realization among the U-boat commanders that their tactics were no longer enough to guarantee survival. As Storch's boat limped back to port, damaged but alive, his logbook contained only a few grim lines. Hunted, detected, depth-charged without visual contact. Radio silence is now our only shield. The battle had been lost, not just on the sea, but in the airwaves. The U-boats had once ruled the Atlantic, but now they had been exposed. The invisible predator had become a visible target. The dawn of the unseen enemy had arrived, and with it, the slow death of the U-boat's reign. This new weapon, Huff-Duff, had altered the very nature of naval warfare. What had once been an unseen struggle beneath the waves, one where the U-boats ruled with stealth and surprise, was now a battle of detection and evasion, a battle that no amount of cunning could win. The technology of the Allies had turned the Wolfpack's greatest strength into its most fatal flaw. The invisible net woven through the airwaves was closing in. The year 1943 marked a pivotal shift in the Battle of the Atlantic. As the U-boat Wolfpacks ruled the depths, relentless in their pursuit of Allied convoys, a new chapter began to unfold. The tides of war had changed, and it wasn't the German U-boat captains who were learning to adapt to the increasingly dangerous waters, but the Allies who were preparing to hunt them down. The arrival of a groundbreaking combination of technology and strategy would forever alter the dynamics of the convoy battle. The U-boat's reign of terror was largely built on its ability to stay hidden, lurking beneath the waves with deadly silence. But as the Allies began to perfect radar and HFDF technology, that once feared silence was pierced. It was a devastating revelation for the German commanders. They had mastered the art of stealth, but they were unaware that the Allies were preparing to do the same. Enter the hunter-killer groups. The Allied response to the Wolfpack was not one of mere defense. It was an aggressive shift, transforming the nature of convoy protection. No longer would convoys simply hope to survive. They would fight back, relentlessly and with precision. The hunter-killer doctrine would turn the hunter into the hunted. It was the dawn of the unseen enemy. The creation of these specialized task forces centered around escort carriers was not just a strategic move. It was a complete reimagining of naval warfare. Previously, Allied convoy escorts, such as destroyers and corvettes, were mainly tasked with defending the cargo ships from U-boat attacks. They were reactive, responding to the Wolfpack's maneuvers, always a step behind, always trying to play catch-up. But now, the tables were about to turn. What set the hunter-killer groups apart was the way they combined radar and HF-DF technology. This combination provided the Allies with a nearly perfect method of tracking U-boats. Radar could detect U-boats on the surface, and HF-DF was able to pinpoint their exact location based on the transmissions from their radios. The Allies could now triangulate a U-boat's position with startling accuracy, even if the U-boat was submerged. This shift in strategy was not just about having the right tools. It was about using those tools in a way that forced the U-boats into a corner. The Wolfpacks could no longer hide in the darkness, knowing that their communications, vital to coordinating their attacks, could now be intercepted and tracked. The once terrifying U-boat menace, feared for its ability to strike without warning, now had to face an enemy that could anticipate its every move. But it wasn't just technology that was driving this new doctrine. It was the willingness of the Allies to turn defense into predation. For decades, the battle in the Atlantic had been one of survival, of convoys crossing the ocean under the threat of constant attack. Now, the Allies weren't just trying to defend. They were actively seeking out the U-boats. The key to the success of the hunter-killer groups lay in their composition. Escort carriers equipped with radar were the core of these groups. These carriers provided not only protection, but a means of launching air attacks. The planes that flew off these ships were equipped with sonar, depth charges, and the crucial ability to spot U-boats even when they were submerged. No longer would U-boats be able to launch their attacks from the shadows. No longer would they be able to lurk undetected, hoping to strike and disappear. The task forces were a sight to behold, a tight-knit coalition of destroyers, corvettes, and escort carriers, moving as one, hunting their prey with a focused relentlessness. For the U-boat commanders, it was a nightmare they had never anticipated. The hunters were now organized, coordinated, and armed with the best technology to do the job. One of the most dramatic moments of this shift occurred during the battle for Convoy ONS-5 in May 1943. In the early days of the convoy, the U-boat Wolfpacks had the upper hand. The convoy, making its way across the Atlantic, had been vulnerable, with the Wolfpacks attacking from all directions. However, the arrival of the hunter-killer groups changed everything. The convoy's escorts, now equipped with radar and HF-DF, began to systematically hunt down the U-boats. It wasn't long before the first attacks were made. The U-boat crews, who had once been the predators, now found themselves on the receiving end. For many of the U-boat commanders, it was an experience of utter disbelief. One U-boat captain's log entry from that engagement perfectly captured the shock of the moment. The captain had just ordered his crew to dive deep after spotting a distant Allied destroyer. For the first time, they were not being tracked visually or acoustically. It was as if the enemy knew exactly where they were without even seeing them. They had been detected by the very thing they had worked so hard to avoid, the invisible hand of Allied radar and HF-DF. As the depth charges rained down, the captain's disbelief was palpable. How had they been found? They were submerged, silent, and seemingly hidden from view. Yet the depth charges came with pinpoint accuracy, hitting their mark. In that moment, the U-boat captain realized that the balance of power had irrevocably shifted. The invisible enemy had found them. This new doctrine of offense over defense did more than just win battles. It reshaped the entire tactical approach to the convoy war. The Wolfpacks, once feared for their ability to ambush and destroy, now had to contend with a relentless, unyielding force that would stop at nothing to hunt them down. The U-boat fleet, no longer just out for the kill, was now the prey in a relentless chase. The impact of the hunter-killer groups would prove to be catastrophic for the U-boat fleet. By the end of 1943, the tide had turned, and the once dominant U-boats were being sunk in greater numbers than ever before. The invisible net cast by the Allies had closed in on the Wolfpacks, trapping them in a death sentence they could no longer escape. This shift in strategy not only marked the end of the U-boats' dominance in the Battle of the Atlantic, but it also signified a greater truth. Technology, when combined with strategy and determination, could fundamentally alter the course of war. The hunter-killer doctrine turned the tables, transforming the Allies from defenders to predators. The U-boat Wolfpacks, which had once been the apex predators of the Atlantic, were now being hunted, and that would be their undoing. By the summer of 1944, the Kriegsmarine was in a state of profound crisis. The relentless efforts to maintain the dominance of the U-boat fleet had reached their peak. But as Admiral Karl Dönitz sat in his command bunker, far removed from the tumult of battle, a sense of grim inevitability settled over him. The great Wolfpacks, which had once ruled the waves with fearsome precision, were now being hunted down with terrifying efficiency. It wasn't just the loss of ships that haunted Dönitz. It was the realization that the war, at least in the Atlantic, was lost. It had begun with the first sightings of strange ships. Convoy escorts, bristling with new radar and HFDF technology, had begun to pinpoint the positions of submerged U-boats even in the vast expanse of the Atlantic. These were ships that had no visual or acoustic contact with the enemy, yet they were systematically destroying the very Wolfpacks that had terrorized Allied shipping for so long. The invisibility that had once been the hallmark of the U-boats, their ability to attack unseen and undetected, was now a double-edged sword. The same technologies that had allowed the Germans to dominate the seas were now being used against them. Dönitz had lived through the early days of the war, when his U-boat fleet was the terror of the Atlantic. He had experienced the heady rush of success, watching as his Wolfpacks sank merchant ships, crippling Britain's lifeblood and threatening to sever the vital links between Europe and America. But now, in 1944, that same power had turned against him. The Allied countermeasures, first slow and uncoordinated, had evolved into a relentless, crushing force. Dönitz had seen it with his own eyes during the Battle of the Atlantic. The slow, implacable encirclement of his Wolfpacks as escort carriers, radar-equipped ships, and HFDF stations turned the tables on the U-boats. The enemy was no longer the prey, it was the predator. The pivotal moment came in the summer of 1944. Dönitz, having exhausted every tactical maneuver he could think of, had no choice but to face the truth. The U-boat, once the ultimate weapon of the Kriegsmarine, was now vulnerable to the very technologies it had once feared. The sonar pulses, the triangulated signals, the new depth charge patterns, everything was converging on the U-boat, and there was no escape. For Dönitz, this was not just a military defeat, it was a personal betrayal. He had staked his career, his reputation, and his strategic genius on the U-boat. He had made the call to escalate the war in the Atlantic, pushing his submarines into the open sea to take on the convoys head-to-head. He had been convinced that his Wolfpacks, with their speed, stealth, and overwhelming numbers, could outfight anything the Allies could throw at them. But now, as he sat at his desk in his command bunker, he understood the scope of the failure. The Allies had learned, adapted, and evolved in ways that his own forces had not. The technology that had allowed them to remain undetected had been cracked. The very things that had been his greatest advantage were now his greatest liabilities. By mid-1944, the Kriegsmarine was facing a strategic collapse. Dönitz, despite his previous insistence that victory was still possible, began to see the writing on the wall. His U-boats were being hunted with a precision that left them no room to maneuver. The convoy routes that had once been his prime hunting ground were now patrolled by an unyielding force of radar-equipped escorts and air cover. The mid-Atlantic gap, once the U-boat sanctuary, was now a death trap, where every submerged vessel could be detected and destroyed. In a moment of desperate clarity, Dönitz made the unthinkable decision. He issued the order for a full retreat from the Atlantic. The war in the Atlantic had been decisively lost, not through lack of courage or bravery, but through the overwhelming power of the Allied technological advantage. The Wolfpacks had been rendered obsolete. There was no longer any hope of winning the battle on the high seas. The retreat was inevitable, and Dönitz understood that it was not just the end of the war for the Kriegsmarine, but a pivotal moment in the broader conflict. The mass withdrawal of the U-boats from the Atlantic marked the end of an era. For the Allies, it was a defining moment of victory. The terror that had gripped the sea lanes for so long was finally over. The once feared U-boat had been hunted to extinction, not by the bravery of the convoy escorts, but by the brilliance of new technologies that allowed the Allies to turn the tables on their enemies. The battle for the Atlantic, which had raged for years, was over, and the tides had irrevocably turned in favor of the Allies. Dönitz's final signal, sent to his fleet commanders, was a grim acknowledgement of the reality he had faced. It was not a message of defeat. It was a message of survival. The U-boats would retreat and the Kriegsmarine would regroup, but the Atlantic was no longer a battleground they could hope to win. The ultimate cost of the Battle of the Atlantic had been realized not in the number of ships sunk, but in the understanding that technology, once wielded by the enemy, had irrevocably altered the course of the war. As Dönitz sat back in his chair, the weight of his decision pressed down on him. The war was far from over, but for him, the loss of the Battle of the Atlantic was a devastating blow. The U-boats had failed. They had been outpaced, outgunned, and, most tragically of all, outthought. The relentless hunt for the Wolfpacks was over, and with it, the hope of victory in the Atlantic. The war would continue, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. The Allies had won the crucial battle for the seas.